I discovered that in Pakistan alone, there's an average of 3 honor killings a day, often with the word Allah dripping from the lips of the murderers, so that even though this is a crime of culture, it is done, committed in the name of religion, which is why it becomes something for us people of faith, Muslims in particular, to own up to. And no, this statistic does not come from a neocon institute, but from Amnesty International, among the world's most respected human rights monitors, and one, by the way, that is now headed by a Muslim woman. Try accusing her of Islamophobia. I discovered that in moderate Muslim countries, such as Algeria and Tunisia, Muslim women cannot marry outside of the faith. Men, on the other hand, can, since they'll be converting their wives to the faith. I discovered that in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, America's good buddy, women are, in fact, property of men by law. They can be passed down from their fathers to their husbands, to their sons, to their brothers. In other words, women in Saudi Arabia have the legal status of a used car, and yet they're not even permitted to drive a new car. And I discovered in the Islamic Republic of Iran, not America's good buddy, if a woman is merely suspected of homosexuality and the religious police get their hands on her, she will be draped in a pristine, clean white sheet, lowered into a freshly dug dirt pit, and stoned alive. Same with men, by the way. As a very troubling video clip in my, excuse me, ma'am, you will have time for a Q&A as soon as I'm done, and I welcome your question. But I just want to finish up this point. A very troubling video clip in my own PBS documentary attests to that fact. And so, contending with all of this information, I had to flash back to that brash question asked of me by my boss. How do you reconcile such elemental injustices with your Muslim faith? I knew I had to address this one head on. And from that crisis of conscience emerged my book, The Trouble with Islam Today. Now, I'll let you take a read of the book for yourself to see how I describe what is the trouble with Islam today and how the trouble with Islam today can be corrected by what has always been beautiful about Islam. But let me just get on with the story of Salman Rushdie by pointing out this next bit. When I began writing the book, I struggled emotionally. Not because I feared being called a sellout. Hell, I knew I would be. Anybody who goes against the grain of his or her own community is bound to get that accusation. And in any event, I figured then, as I'm still convinced today, it's those who exploit the Quran to justify abuses of human rights. They are the ones betraying my faith, not me. So this traitor business is so not my issue, let me assure you. My issue is and was much more higher stakes. I knew that by writing a book like this, I would be putting myself on the firing line. Maybe literally. And what's a nice girl from Canada doing taking on Osama bin Laden? Well, as it turns out, during this period of struggle, I had the unexpected, unforeseen opportunity to speak with Salman Rushdie. And I asked him, what else? A question. Why would you support a young Muslim woman writing the kind of book that might invite into her life the violence and chaos that's been visited upon yours? And without any hesitation, he replied, because a book is more important than a life. Now, I laughed, thinking this guy has a great sense of humor. He's obviously making light of his precarious security situation, and he's about to tell me the serious answer. And I waited. And then I realized that was the serious answer. And he explained. Whenever a writer puts out a thought, it can be disagreed with, vigorously, vehemently, even violently. But it cannot be unthought. And that, he emphasized, is the great permanent gift that the writer gives to this world. Notice that he stressed the word permanent. He wasn't denying that I might be offed for voicing my views. Not at all. It's a real possibility. He was implying, rather strongly I might add, that the purpose with which we live is often more important than the number of years with which we live. And it goes back to that definition of courage which I embrace. Courage is not the absence of fear. Instead, it is the recognition that some things are more important than fear. Some things like your passion and your purpose along with mine. For the next 2 years, I know that not everybody can clap at that. You just don't want death threats. I understand that. I understand that sometimes you actually do have to make stark choices. And I don't begrudge you if you decide to not choose the death threat, okay? But I have to say that for the next 2 weeks, I tried to choose something other than the death threat. I actually did try to come up with a counter-argument, one that would let me off the hook for writing this book. I couldn't. And that is when I knew I'd made more than just the intellectual commitment, the emotional commitment to write The Trouble with Islam Today, whatever the consequences of doing so. So, what have the consequences been, and what are they still? Since we're on the subject, yeah, death threats. Plenty of them. They started in the traditional Islamic world, but interestingly enough, they've migrated west. I receive a disproportionate number from Western Europe, Scandinavia, and the UK in particular. I've even gotten some from my own country of kinder, gentler Canada. In fact, a recent threat in the language of Urdu described me as the woman writer who is now subject to death. Interesting how the would-be assassin zeroed in on the woman part. And that one came not from Islamabad or Karachi or Lahore, Pakistan. Rather, the Toronto police traced that threat to an internet cafe in downtown Toronto, my city. Just another reason to stick around in Washington, D.C. And you know we live in a very kooky time when Washington, D.C. might be a little safer than a Canadian city. Very kooky. It's also true that I live behind bulletproof windows at home and that I know what to look for under a car, inside a car, around a car before I turn on the ignition. It is true that I had a bodyguard for a few months, 24/7, and it is further true that he was gorgeous.